The sound of a bowl shattering on the wooden floor stopped every knife in the Ember Room's dining hall. Marin Callahan stood frozen, steam still rising from the darkened shoulder of her uniform, her hands trembling before her mind could catch up to what had just happened to her. Warren Kessler, the man who had owned this place for 29 years, still held the empty bowl in his hand, his voice as calm as if he were ordering dinner. "Will you remember now?" 40 people in that room saw it happen. Not one of them stood up. The floor manager looked down at his reservation book. A guest pulled out a phone, then quietly put it away. For 2 full minutes, the only thing moving inside the Ember Room was the steam. But there was one thing Warren Kessler did not know. In the kitchen behind him, a 61-year-old woman was dialing a number with shaking hands, a number she had kept hidden behind a photograph in her wallet for 6 months. She sent only 7 words. 5 minutes later, the restaurant's glass doors opened. A man in a black wool coat walked in. 5 men behind him, none of them saying a word. No one reached into a pocket. No one raised a voice. But when one of the 3 guests, seated at Kessler's table, recognized that face and whispered a name, his chair went over backward onto the floor. And for the first time in 29 years, Warren Kessler looked down at his own hand and saw it shaking. If you believe no one should have to stay silent just to keep their job, please leave a like on this story. Share it with someone who has ever had to lower their head in a room of their own. And subscribe to our channel, because every week we tell a story for the people who chose to stand up. 14 hours before that bowl struck the floor, morning in Charlestown began the way every morning had begun for the past 3 years. Marin Callahan woke at 5:40, before the alarm had a chance to ring, because her body had grown used to waking earlier than the things meant to remind her that she had to get up. She heated water, sliced bread, and set 2 plates on the small table pushed against the window. The 3rd-floor apartment had only 2 rooms, low ceilings, and heating pipes that clicked whenever the weather turned cold. But it was theirs, and that was the only thing she needed it to be. Toby came out of the bedroom with his hair sticking straight up on one side. 9 years old, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, he held a sheet of paper folded carefully into quarters, so carefully that she knew at once it mattered. The boy sat down, placed the paper face down on the table, then raised his hands and signed that he had slept well. Marin signed back that she had too. It was the first lie of the day, and it was so light that she could barely feel its weight. They ate breakfast that way, inside a kind of silence that was never empty. In this home, silence didn't mean no one was saying anything. Their hands spoke constantly. Toby told her about play rehearsal, about how his teacher had given him the role of the lighthouse keeper because he was the only one in the class who could remember the entire order of the scenes. Marin asked if he liked the part. Toby thought about it longer than he needed to, then answered that the lighthouse keeper didn't have a single line, but if he didn't do his job, the ships wouldn't find their way home. Marin stopped with her hands halfway through a gesture. There were mornings when she thought her 9-year-old brother understood more about the world than she did. Then Toby turned the paper over and pushed it across the table. It was a crayon drawing, the lines still clumsy, the colors spilling outside the edges. A house with a red roof, 1 yellow window, and some kind of tree that was probably a pine. Beneath the roof stood 3 people. The tallest had brown hair tied low, and was holding hands with someone much smaller, clearly the 2 of them, sister and brother. But there was a 3rd person standing on the other side, taller even than the first, colored entirely in black from shoulders to feet. Marin looked at the drawing longer than she meant to. She picked it up, tilted it toward the light, and felt something tighten very softly inside her chest. She lifted one hand, about to ask. Her fingers were already in the right position to begin the question. Then she lowered her hand, smiled, and signed only that the picture was beautiful, that she would put it up on the living room wall that very night when she got home from work. Toby nodded, satisfied, and went back to his bread. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. And that was one of the things Marin loved most about her little brother, that he let things remain exactly where they belonged until they were ready to be spoken. When Toby went into the bedroom to get dressed, Marin stood and cleared the table, and her eyes passed over the refrigerator door the way they did every day. There, beneath an apple-shaped magnet, was the medical debt notice bearing their mother's name, $41,000, 3 years since she had died, and the number was still there, patient, neither angry nor merciful. In those 3 years, Marin had managed to pay $9,200. She knew the exact amount because she counted it again in her head every night on the train ride home, like someone counting steps in the dark to know how far she still was from solid ground. Beside that paper was the lease for this apartment, signed 3 weeks earlier, her signature on the final line still looking fresh. The landlord had required 3 months of deposit because she didn't have a guarantor. She had handed over everything she had managed to save, and that meant everything she had now depended on her job at the Ember Room. She took the magnet, pinned Toby's drawing over the debt notice, and covered the number completely. Then she put on her coat, zipped it all the way to her throat, and walked her little brother to school just as she did every other morning. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Marin stepped through the back door of the Ember Room, hung her coat on hook number 11, and became someone else. At home, she was the person who spoke with her hands. Here, she spoke with her shoulders, with her footsteps, with her ability to move through a crowded dining room without touching anyone. 6 months on the job had taught her that in a place like this, the best server was the one who made people forget she was there at all. The dinner shift began at 5 o'clock. By 7, table number 14 called her over. A middle-aged man was dining with his wife, and his sea bass had arrived 12 minutes late and half cold. He didn't shout. Guests at the Ember Room never shouted. They simply spoke in a voice quiet enough to make the people around them tilt their heads, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. He said he had paid $120 for a plate of cold fish, and he wanted to know who was responsible. Marin didn't apologize on behalf of the kitchen. She didn't say the dish had come out late because 3 orders had hit at once, and she didn't mention that the head chef was short 1 person. She bent down just enough to meet his eyes, apologized for exactly one thing, that he had been made to wait, then carried the plate away. 7 minutes later, she returned with a fresh plate, still steaming, and a glass of white wine that she had charged to her own shift expense. She didn't tell him she was paying for it. She simply set it down and said the kitchen wanted to offer its apologies. The man looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. When the couple left at 9 o'clock, the wife stopped at the door, searched for Marin through the crowd, and said thank you in the way people only did when they truly meant it. Curtis Vane stood beside the host stand, about 10 feet away, and had seen everything. He didn't say a word to her. He waited until the couple had disappeared from view, then opened the leather-bound book resting on the stand, the book everyone here knew about but no one ever called by its proper name, and wrote 3 lines. Marin passed by just as he was writing. She saw her name. She saw the table number. She didn't see the rest, but she had worked here long enough to know there was no column in that book for a guest leaving satisfied. There was only a column recording that a complaint had been made, and who had been present when it happened. At the Ember Room, doing the right thing didn't erase the line. It only made the line a little shorter. At 9:20, she stepped back into the kitchen corridor to collect a dessert tray, and Bernadette Nolan stopped her with one wet hand. 61 years old, 19 years stationed at the sink at the far end of the kitchen, and everyone in this restaurant called her Birdie, even the ones who had never bothered to ask her real name. She didn't say anything. She simply pressed a piece of still warm bread, wrapped in a paper napkin, into Marin's hand, then tipped her head toward the hidden corner behind the refrigerator where the camera couldn't reach. Marin started to say she wasn't hungry. Birdie looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had raised 3 children washing dishes, and knew exactly what a person looked like when they hadn't eaten since 6 o'clock that morning. Marin ate the piece of bread in 40 seconds, standing with her back against the wall, and when she finished, Birdie had already returned to the sink as though nothing had happened. Then the kitchen door swung open, and Curtis walked in. He didn't need to raise his voice. He only said that Mr. Kessler would be arriving at 10 o'clock with 3 guests, and the table needed to be prepared. The knives stopped. The water stopped. The kitchen assistant, holding a stack of plates, froze with the plates still in his hands. For 3 seconds, the only thing moving in that kitchen was the steam rising from the stockpot. No one asked why. No one explained. Those 3 seconds of silence had already said everything the 9 people in that kitchen needed to know. And Marin, standing in the hidden corner behind the refrigerator with breadcrumbs still clinging to her fingertips, understood that her evening had only just begun. At 9:32, the phone in Marin's apron pocket vibrated exactly once. She waited until she had taken the dessert tray out of the cabinet, waited until Curtis turned his back, and only then glanced at the screen. 7 words, no greeting, no question mark. When your shift ends, I'll wait at Hanover Corner. She turned off the screen and pushed the phone deeper into her pocket, but something inside her chest had loosened just a little, and she hated that after all this time, it could still do that to her. 14 months earlier, on a rainy February night, a man walked into the Ember Room close to midnight and asked for a table for one. The shoulders of his black wool coat were wet. The kitchen was getting ready to close. Curtis had looked at the man's shoes, then at the clock, and said the restaurant was no longer taking orders. Marin said there was still soup. She led him to table number 21 in the farthest corner, brought him a bowl of onion soup and half a loaf of bread, poured him water, and didn't ask another question. She didn't ask why he had come so late, didn't ask what he did for a living, didn't stare too long at the watch on his wrist. She treated him the way she would have treated any man who walked into a restaurant at midnight in the rain, which was simply as someone who was hungry. Later, he told her that no one had treated him that way in 7 years. People either bowed their heads or stepped back. No one simply brought him soup. He introduced himself as someone who worked in commercial real estate. That wasn't a lie. It simply wasn't enough. 11 months later, on a November afternoon, Maren sat in the waiting area at Toby's school and opened her phone to pass the time. The article was on a local news page, accompanied by a slightly blurred photograph taken from a distance at the harbor. She recognized the shape of his shoulders before she recognized his face. She read the entire article twice, the first time to understand it, the second time to find some place in it where there might have been a mistake. There wasn't one. When she looked up, Toby was waving at her through the glass door, and she realized her hands had gone so cold that she couldn't sign back. She disappeared for 7 days. She didn't answer his messages, didn't take his calls, changed her shifts to afternoons so she wouldn't have to pass Hanover Corner. During those 7 days, he didn't come looking for her even once. There was no car parked outside her building, no one standing at the end of her street, no flowers sent to her door. Later, she understood that it was precisely that absence that made her go back. A man capable of finding her in 40 minutes had chosen not to, and he kept making that choice for an entire week. On the 8th day, she called him and arranged to meet at a coffee shop on Salem Street, in broad daylight, somewhere crowded. He arrived 15 minutes early and sat with his back to the door, something she only understood later he had done deliberately, so she could see that he wasn't guarding himself. She didn't ask whether the article was true. She didn't ask what he had done. She placed her hand on the table and said 3 sentences. I don't ask what you do, but you can't bring it anywhere near Toby, and you never walk into the place where I work. He sat in silence for a long time. He didn't explain, didn't defend himself, didn't promise to change who he was, and she was more grateful to him for that than she could have been for any promise he might have made. In the end, he asked only one question. He asked whether she was sure, because once he agreed, he would keep his word even if she later wanted him to break it. She said she was sure. 3 months had passed since that afternoon. He waited at Hanover Corner, exactly 100 meters from the restaurant door, 2 nights a week, sitting in his car, never stepping out until she had reached him. He had never met Toby. He had never crossed through the glass doors of the Ember Room, not even on nights of heavy rain, not even on nights when her shift ended at 1 o'clock in the morning. 3 months, not once. At 9:47, Maren slipped the phone back into her apron pocket and carried the dessert tray into the dining room. 13 minutes remained until 10 o'clock. Mr. and Mrs. Ainsley arrived at 9:50, 10 minutes before their reservation, the way people their age often did when an evening meant something. The husband was 79, moving a little slowly, one hand held behind his wife's back without touching her, simply there in case she needed it. The wife was 77, her silver hair pinned high, wearing a blue wool coat that she carefully removed and folded before sitting down instead of handing it to the coat check attendant. Maren led them to table number 7, the only table in the dining room with an unobstructed view of the harbor water, and Mrs. Ainsley paused for a second when she saw the window, then turned to look at her husband. They had reserved this table 3 weeks earlier. Maren remembered because she had taken the call herself. The man on the phone had asked very carefully whether table number 7 would definitely be available that evening, asking twice, and when she confirmed it, he thanked her in a way that made her add one more line to the reservation book. 55th anniversary. Walter Ainsley sat down, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and took out a small wooden box no larger than his palm. The wood was dark, polished smooth by time, and he placed it to the right of his dinner plate. He didn't open it. He simply set it there neatly, the edge of the box parallel with the edge of the table, then rested his hand on top of it for just a moment. Josephine Ainsley saw the box and smiled. She didn't ask what was inside. Maren poured their water, read them the evening menu, and when Mrs. Ainsley said she could no longer make out the small print, Maren read it again, more slowly the second time, without making it seem as though she were repeating herself. She took their order, thanked them, and turned away with the feeling that, for at least one moment in the past 48 minutes, she had done something right. At exactly 10 o'clock, the glass door opened, and Warren Kessler walked in with 3 men. He removed his scarf and handed it to Curtis without looking at him, then stood in the middle of the aisle and surveyed his dining room the way a man might study a balance sheet. The 3 men with him were accustomed to being taken to the best table in the room. Kessler pointed toward the window. loud enough for half the dining room to hear. He told them that from that table they could see the entire stretch of water, and that he had kept it for 29 years for conversations worth having. Curtis got to Maren first. He leaned close and told her quietly that the owner wanted table number 7, and that she should move the older couple to table number 19 beside the kitchen door, with a complimentary bottle of wine so they wouldn't mind. Maren looked toward table number 7. Walter Ainsley was saying something that made his wife laugh softly, lifting one hand to cover her mouth like an 18-year-old girl. Maren told Curtis that table number 19 was right beside the kitchen door, and that Mrs. Ainsley was hard of hearing. Curtis looked at her for 3 seconds, then stepped back. He didn't argue. He simply moved aside. And the way he moved aside made Maren understand that he had just decided he no longer wanted to be standing next to her. Kessler came over himself. He stopped 1 meter away from her, his hands in his pockets, and spoke in the voice of a man reminding an employee about some minor matter. He told her to ask the 2 guests to change tables, said they would send them dessert and a bottle of wine, that at their age people couldn't tell one window from another anyway. Maren didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice either. She placed both hands in front of her stomach in the exact posture every server there had been taught, lifted her eyes to his, and said they had reserved that table 3 weeks ago, sir. There was one very brief moment when they both understood exactly what had just happened. It wasn't a refusal. It was something more dangerous than that in a room like this. An employee had just told her employer no in front of 3 men he wanted to impress, and she had said it so gently that no one could call it disrespectful. Kessler turned back toward his 3 guests and smiled. He said loudly that the table in the center of the room had far better lighting, then led them over to it. The other 3 men laughed along. No one in the dining room realized what had just happened. As Kessler passed Maren, he slowed by exactly half a step. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes straight ahead, the smile still fixed on his face for the benefit of his 3 guests, and spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear. You've just chosen the rest of your evening. Then he kept walking, pulled out a chair for one of the 3 men, and laughed at a joke Maren couldn't quite hear. She remained where she was for another 4 seconds. At table number 7, Josephine Ainsley was pointing out toward the water, telling her husband that the harbor lights seemed brighter tonight than they ever had before. At 10:15, Kessler called Curtis over and said 2 things. The first was to stop taking new guests, lock the doors once the 2 waiting tables had been seated, and keep the rest of the night quiet. The second was shorter. The lobby camera system needed maintenance, and he wanted it handled right now. Curtis didn't ask why a system that had been inspected only 2 weeks earlier needed maintenance at 10 o'clock at night. He nodded, walked down the back hallway, opened the electrical cabinet, and switched off 2 cameras. The first covered the host stand and the entrance. The second covered the entire main dining room. 2 green indicator lights went dark. He stood in front of the electrical cabinet for another moment. There was one more camera, the one mounted on the kitchen ceiling, aimed down at the plating station and the employee entrance, the one Kessler himself had ordered installed 4 years earlier after a case of wine disappeared, and he became convinced someone in the kitchen had stolen it. It wasn't connected to the same system as the other 2. It had its own power supply, its own recorder, and the only person who knew the password was Kessler himself. Curtis knew that. His boss simply didn't remember it tonight. He closed the electrical cabinet, locked it, and returned to the dining room without saying a word. It was the only thing he dared to do that night, and he would carry it with him for the next 2 months, like a pebble trapped inside his shoe. At 10:23, Maren carried 4 glasses of whiskey to the table in the middle of the room. Kessler took a sip, set his glass down, and said the ice was broken. She took all 4 glasses away and made them again. The second time, he said the whiskey had been watered down. The third time, he didn't drink at all. He simply stared into the glass for a long while, then pushed it toward the center of the table, and said he didn't think he needed to explain to a server what a proper glass of whiskey was supposed to look like. The 3 guests lowered their eyes to their menus. One of them picked up his phone without opening anything. He simply held it. The 4th time, Maren set the tray down, and just as she withdrew her hand, Kessler's elbow touched one of the 4 glasses. It tipped over. Whiskey spread across the tabletop, ran over the edge, and dripped onto the wooden floor. He didn't apologize. He moved his chair back exactly 30 centimeters, folded his arms, and waited. Maren knelt to wipe the floor. She cleaned it with the towel draped over her arm, slowly, exactly the way she had been taught to do when it had to be done in front of guests. From where she was, she could see Kessler's leather shoes 40 centimeters from her face. She could see the edge of the tablecloth. She could see the leg of table number 7 in the distance, and one corner of the small wooden box still resting beside Walter Ainsley's plate. When she stood, Kessler told her to stay there. He said he would be ordering the main course in a few minutes, and didn't want to have to look for someone when he needed them. 10 minutes. She stood exactly 1 meter from the table, both hands resting in front of her stomach, while 4 men discussed a deal at the southern harbor as though she were a floor lamp. No one looked at her. That was the hardest part. Not being looked at, but not being seen. There was something people who had never stood in that position didn't understand. Maren didn't count the humiliations. She didn't keep a list of them in her head, didn't rank them, didn't tell herself she would remember. During those 10 minutes, she counted something else. $31,800. That was what remained on the paper attached to the refrigerator door, the part hidden beneath the drawing of 3 people, standing under one roof. 3 months of security deposit already handed to the landlord and impossible to recover. 3 weeks since she had signed her name on the final line of the lease. 9 people in the kitchen behind her, every one of them carrying a number of their own inside their head. And that was why none of those 9 people came out. People like to think endurance came from weakness. It didn't. It was arithmetic. And that arithmetic always produced the same answer for people who had nothing beneath them to fall onto but themselves. At 10:41, Kessler opened the menu. He asked which soup in the kitchen was served the hottest. Maren said it was the seafood soup, brought out the moment it left the kitchen. He closed the menu, handed it to her, and said he wanted a bowl. Then he added one more sentence in that same calm voice, saying he wanted her to bring it out herself, no one else. In the kitchen, Bertie looked up from the sink when she heard the order called. She looked at Maren. Maren didn't look back. On the kitchen ceiling, 4 meters from where the 2 women stood, a small red indicator light continued blinking steadily, just as it had for the past 4 years. Her legs gave way before she had time to decide to let them. Maren sank all the way down onto the wooden floor, one hand braced against it, the other holding her right shoulder without daring to touch it. And for those first few moments, she couldn't think at all. There were no thoughts, only the sound of her own breathing, terribly loud in her ears, and the faint clink of one glass touching another somewhere behind her. Curtis Vane walked toward her. For 3 seconds, something inside Maren's chest lifted. She had worked with this man for 6 months. He knew her brother's name. Once, back in September, he had changed her shift so she could attend a parent-teacher meeting. Curtis lowered himself onto one knee, half a meter away, and picked up the 2 largest pieces of broken porcelain. He arranged them neatly in his palm. Then he stood, pulled the white towel from his arm, turned around, and handed it to Warren Kessler. A few drops had splashed onto Kessler's sleeve. Kessler took the towel, wiped his sleeve twice, then tossed it onto the table. Curtis waited until he was finished, took the towel back, and retreated toward the host stand with the 2 pieces of porcelain still in his hand. Maren watched him go. She would remember that moment longer than she would remember the moment the bowl left Kessler's hand, because a person can be cruel in one impulsive second, but it takes a lifetime to become someone who knows exactly who should be given the towel. Then came the sound of a chair being pushed back. At table number 7, Walter Ainsley stood up. He straightened slowly, and with difficulty, one hand gripping the edge of the table for balance. At 79 years old, even rising from a chair took time, and during that time the entire dining room saw him. He didn't say anything. He simply turned toward the center of the room, where the 4 men were sitting, and managed exactly 1 step. Josephine Ainsley caught her husband's wrist. She didn't pull hard. She simply held on. That 77-year-old hand closed around his wrist and didn't let go, and when he looked down at her, she shook her head. Just once. Her eyes were full of tears, and she didn't blink, because if she blinked, the tears would fall, and he would see them. 4 months earlier, that woman had sat for 3 hours in the 6th-floor hallway of a hospital on Cambridge Street, waiting for someone to tell her whether her husband was going to live or die. She had already sat there once. She wasn't going to sit there a second time. Walter Ainsley looked at his wife. Then he looked toward Maren, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't understand at the time. Something that felt like a promise swallowed before it could be spoken. He sat back down. He placed both hands on the tabletop and clenched them so tightly that his knuckles turned white beneath the thin skin. He kept them that way. He didn't eat, didn't drink, and didn't say a single word to his wife for the next 11 minutes. Maren, still sitting on the wooden floor, began to count. 40 people. She counted them the way she counted tables during a crowded shift, out of habit, from left to right, the outer row first, then the inner. Tables 2 and 4 had 2 people each. Table 9 had 4, a family. Table 12 had 3. Tables 15, 16, 18, the couple at table 21, the very table in the farthest corner where, 14 months earlier, she had carried out a bowl of onion soup to a man whose shoulders were wet from the rain. Add the 4 men at the table in the middle of the room. Add Curtis. Add the 9 people in the kitchen beyond the sliding door, all of whom had heard everything. 40. Then she counted how many people were standing. She finished that count very quickly. Behind her, the kitchen door opened a narrow crack and closed again. No one noticed. A 61-year-old woman had seen all she needed to see, and she stepped back inside with both hands still wet, walking straight toward the handbag hanging from a hook in the corner of the kitchen. Kessler returned to his table and sat down. He told the 3 guests that the kitchen was having staffing problems tonight, then ordered another bottle of wine. One of the 3 men laughed. The other 2 didn't. The dining room slowly returned to the sound of knives and forks, slower than before, quieter than before, like a machine that had just taken a blow and was checking itself to see whether it could still run. Maren pushed herself upright with one hand. She needed to reach the kitchen door, and the shortest path from where she stood took her past table number 7. She made it 3 steps. Then came the sound of wood hitting the floor. The small dark box rolled off the edge of table number 7, struck the floor, and broke apart. It didn't crack. It shattered completely, splitting into 3 pieces, the way a hollow object breaks rather than something with machinery inside it. Walter Ainsley let out a small sound and began to bend down. Josephine reached out to stop him, but he had already slipped from his chair, one knee touching the floor, and started feeling around beneath the table for the pieces of wood, with the flustered look of an old man trying to save a keepsake. Someone at the neighboring table turned to look, then turned away. No one stood up to help. Tonight, no one stood up for anything. Maren knelt down. She did it out of professional instinct, because that was what a server was supposed to do when something fell, and because her right shoulder hurt so badly that bending down was easier than standing straight. She leaned halfway beneath the table, picked up the largest piece of wood, and when she looked up, Walter Ainsley was staring directly into her eyes. He wasn't flustered at all. His hand wasn't shaking. His breathing was steady. And in the dark space beneath the tablecloth, the face of that 79-year-old man was completely alert, completely focused, without a trace of the elderly man who had just dropped a treasured object. He held out his hand and opened his palm. Resting there was a black memory card, no larger than a thumbnail. Maren looked at it, then at the 3 pieces of the wooden box scattered across the floor. There was no spindle, no steel comb, no gears, no spring, nothing that could possibly produce a single note of music. The box had never been a music box. It was nothing more than a hollowed-out block of wood, beautiful enough to sit on a dinner table without anyone asking questions, and sturdy enough that it wouldn't break unless someone wanted it to. He had pushed it off the table himself. He pressed the memory card into her palm and folded her fingers around it. 3 seconds. That was all they had beneath that table. And in those 3 seconds, Maren understood 3 things at once. The first was that this man hadn't come here to celebrate anything. Or at least not only to celebrate. The second was that he had sat at table number 7 before, and not just once. She remembered that face in the corner section 2 weeks earlier, and before that, on a quiet Tuesday evening, when she had thought she was simply confusing him with a regular guest. 4 times in 3 weeks. Always at a table overlooking the dining room, always staying a long time, always ordering very little. The third thing was that he had seen everything long before tonight. Walter Ainsley leaned a few inches closer to her. His voice was so low that it was almost not a sound at all, but breath given shape. "Don't give it to anyone here." Then he drew back, picked up 2 pieces of wood, and by the time he emerged from beneath the table, he had become a clumsy old man who had just broken something precious again. He told his wife, loudly enough for the neighboring table to hear, that it was broken now, that he had told her not to bring it with them. Josephine Ainsley looked at her husband. Then she looked down at the floor, where the 3 hollow pieces of wood lay open, exposing their empty insides, and Maren saw her expression change. She hadn't known. For 3 weeks, she hadn't known anything about it. Maren stood up, her right hand clenched tightly shut. She walked toward the kitchen door, no faster than usual, no slower than usual. She passed the host stand where Curtis was bent over the leather-bound book. She passed the table in the middle of the room, where Warren Kessler was pouring wine for the guest seated to his left. In the center of her palm, the memory card was so small that no one could see it. Bernadette Nolan wasn't a brave person. She had known that about herself for a long time, and she had lived with it through 19 years of standing at the sink, at the far end of the Ember Room's kitchen. She had seen many things in those 19 years, and she had never told anyone. She had 3 grown children, a pension still 4 years away, and 2 hands that hot water had robbed of the ability to feel temperature a long time ago. But she kept a photograph in her wallet. 6 months earlier, On a Thursday night, near the end of June, Maren Callahan had collapsed right in the narrow passage between the sink and the refrigerator. There had been no loud sound. She had simply set down a stack of plates, straightened up, then slid down the refrigerator door like a coat slipping from a hook. Bertie later learned that Maren had worked 2 shifts back-to-back for 3 days and had eaten exactly 1 meal a day. Bertie helped her onto her side, called for someone to bring water, and while the 9 people in the kitchen stood around debating whether they should call an ambulance, because an ambulance ride in this city cost $800, she did the simplest thing she could think of. She took the phone from Maren's apron pocket, opened the recent calls list, and tapped the first number. The person who answered didn't say hello. He listened to her speak for 13 seconds, then asked exactly one question. Where is she? 11 minutes later, someone arrived. It wasn't an ambulance. 2 men in dark coats came through the back door, one of them carrying Maren out as though she were a child, while the other remained behind for exactly 30 seconds to ask who had made the call. Bertie raised her hand. The man simply nodded once at her, didn't thank her, didn't ask her name, then walked out. 3 days later, Maren returned to work and told everyone the hospital hadn't charged her because she had insurance. Bertie knew that wasn't true. She had worked in this place for 19 years, and she knew exactly what kind of insurance a night shift server had. That night, when Bertie got home, she opened her wallet, took out the photograph of her 3 children when they were still small, and copied the number onto the back with a ballpoint pen. She didn't tell Maren. She didn't tell anyone. She simply put the photograph back where it had been, and told herself that there were some phone numbers people kept, not because they intended to call them, but because they needed to know they could. For 6 months, she hadn't touched it once. Now, standing in the corner of the kitchen beside the handbag hanging from its hook, her hands still wet and shaking so badly that it took her 3 tries to enter the number correctly, Bernadette Nolan pulled the photograph from her wallet and typed in each digit one by one. She didn't write much. She didn't know how to write much. She typed exactly what she had seen, sent it, then turned off the screen, and slipped the phone into her apron pocket. They're hurting, Maren. Get here right now. She soaked a clean towel in cold water, wrung it out, and when Maren pushed through the sliding door into the kitchen with her right hand clenched shut, Bertie pulled her into the hidden corner behind the refrigerator, eased the fabric away from her shoulder, and laid the cold towel over it. The girl didn't cry out. She only drew in one very deep breath and held it. Then Bertie did the second thing. At the far end of the kitchen, behind the narrow door beside the dry storage room, was a small room, no wider than a closet, and inside it was the recorder for the camera mounted on the ceiling. 4 years earlier, Kessler had stood in this exact spot and told everyone in the kitchen that from now on, he would know who took what. Bertie wiped her hands on her apron, pulled a plastic chair from the corner, placed it directly in front of that narrow door, and sat down. She sat with her back straight, both hands resting on her thighs, her face turned toward the sliding door. She didn't know what she would say if Curtis came in. She only knew that he would have to tell her to get up, and she had already decided that tonight she wouldn't. The black car had been parked at the corner of Hanover Street since 10:30. Engine off, lights off, just as it had been parked there 2 nights a week for the past 3 months. Alessio Vitale sat in the right rear seat with an unopened file resting on his lap. Rocco Bianchi sat in front. The other 3 men were in a second car, parked 20 meters away. And Gideon Frost stood outside in the cold smoking, because he always smoked 1 cigarette before the end of a shift. At 10:57, the phone inside Alessio's coat pocket vibrated. He unlocked the screen with his thumb. An unfamiliar number. 7 words. They're hurting Maren. Get here right now. 4 seconds passed inside the car without anyone speaking. Rocco saw the face of the man in the back seat through the rearview mirror and knew something was wrong. Because in 11 years of working beside this man, he had seen that expression exactly twice. Rocco asked only one question. How do you want this handled? The question wasn't an ordinary question, and both men knew it. It was a list wrapped inside 6 words. It meant how many men, how many ways, and which of those ways do you want? Alessio Vitale sat motionless in the darkness of the back seat, and in that silence, he knew exactly what he was capable of doing. He knew who was on duty at the North Precinct tonight, and who wouldn't answer a phone until morning. He knew 3 different ways a 58-year-old man could lose everything he owned in 11 days, without anyone finding the trace of a single hand behind it. He knew a 4th way, the way his grandfather had used in this harbor district in 1971, the kind of way that made a man's name disappear from conversation forever. He had once stood in a room and spoken a name aloud, and the man who carried that name had left Boston the next morning and had never returned. That wasn't what he was considering. What he was considering was a November afternoon in a coffee shop on Salem Street, when a 27-year-old woman had placed both hands on the table and said 3 sentences, and he had asked her whether she was sure, because once he agreed, he would keep his word even if she later wanted him to break it. She had said she was sure, and at 10:57 that night, he understood something he didn't want to understand. If he did this in the way he knew best, then the man who had thrown that bowl of soup would pay for it. Yes, but Maren Callahan would become the woman something had happened to, and then a man had come and fixed it for her. She would no longer be the woman who had told her employer no in the middle of a dining room filled with 40 people. She would only be the woman who had been rescued. He would take from her the one thing she had never allowed anyone to take. Alessio opened his eyes. "Call an ambulance," he said. "Call the police. Give them the address and the table number." Rocco had already reached for the car door. "No one touches anyone," Alessio continued. "No one. If anyone in there raises a hand first, you stay still and let the cameras see you standing still." Rocco Bianchi was silent for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds lasted longer than they needed to. The 46-year-old man had been with the Vitali family since he was 23, had learned a very old set of rules. And in those rules there was one thing made perfectly clear about what happened when someone laid a hand on one of their own. Then he nodded. "Yes, sir." He took out his phone and began dialing, and his voice when he spoke to the emergency dispatcher was so calm that the dispatcher asked him twice whether he was actually at the scene. Alessio called back the number that had just sent him the message. The phone rang once and a half. Then came the sound of hurried breathing, the sound of running water somewhere in the background, and the voice of an older woman speaking very softly, saying that she was in the kitchen. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what had happened. He said only one thing: "Don't let anyone near the server." The other end went silent for 2 seconds. Then her trembling voice answered that she was sitting directly in front of that room's door, and that she had been sitting there for 7 minutes already. Alessio Vitali ended the call, opened the car door, and stepped out onto the cold sidewalk of Hanover Street. 100 meters away stood the glass door he had promised he would never walk through. Bertie had helped her out to sit on the step between the kitchen and the dining room, where the sliding door stood partly open, because the kitchen was too hot, and Maren couldn't bear the heat anymore. She sat with her back against the doorframe, the wet towel on her shoulder long since warmed against her skin, her right hand still clenched around something no larger than a thumbnail that she hadn't yet dared to open her palm and look at. From where she sat, she could hear the dining room more clearly than she could see it. She heard the clink of knives and forks, the sound of wine being poured from a bottle, Warren Kessler laughing at some joke, the laughter of a man who had decided that whatever had happened tonight was over. Then she heard the glass door open. She didn't look up. The restaurant had stopped taking guests an hour earlier, so it could only be someone from the kitchen stepping outside to smoke, or Curtis going to lock the door. But the dining room went silent, not gradually quieter, silent all at once, as though someone had cut the power. And in that silence, Maren heard one sound with perfect clarity, so out of place that it seemed to split the room open. A chair falling onto the wooden floor. Then footsteps. Several people, moving evenly, not hurried, not heavy. She still didn't look up. Her shoulder hurt so badly that raising her head required a decision, and she hadn't made that decision yet. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. She saw the shoes first. Black leather, rounded toes. The outer edge of the left shoe worn slightly more than the right, because this man shifted his weight a little toward his left side when he walked, something she had noticed long ago and had never mentioned. She saw the hem of his black wool coat, damp around the edge from the snow outside. Maren looked up, and the first thing she felt wasn't relief. For one very brief moment, what moved through her chest was a clear, piercing fear, because she understood immediately what had just happened. 3 months earlier, in a coffee shop on Salem Street in broad daylight, she had laid down 3 conditions, and he had asked whether she was sure. And he had kept his word for 3 months, 2 nights a week, parking exactly 100 meters from this door in rain and snow, never once stepping out of the car before she reached him. Now he was standing inside. This was the first time Alessio Vitali had ever broken a promise to her, and he had chosen to break that particular promise on this particular night, and she understood that whatever someone had told him over the phone must have been very bad for him to do it. He didn't say anything. He didn't look toward the middle of the room, where Warren Kessler was getting to his feet. He didn't look toward Curtis Vane, who was gripping the edge of the host stand. He didn't look at the 3 men seated with Kessler, one of whom still hadn't picked up his fallen chair. During all that time, the man who had just walked into the Ember Room didn't spare the room a single glance. He took off his coat. He did it slowly, almost carefully, then draped it over Maren's shoulders, lowering it so gently that it didn't touch her injured right shoulder. Then he knelt down, both knees on the wooden floor, right in the middle of the aisle of a restaurant where 40 people were watching. He lowered himself until his eyes were exactly level with hers, not even an inch higher. "Can you breathe?" Those were the first words he spoke inside this building. Not what happened, not who did this. Not "are you okay?" the kind of question people ask because they want to hear that everything is fine. "Can you breathe?" Maren opened her mouth. There were so many things that should have come out, and she was 27 years old and had learned how to put everything in order of importance since she was 19. And tonight that order in her mind had only one line at the very top. She whispered, "I'm going to lose my job." Something happened to Alessio Vitali's face when he heard those words, and Bertie Nolan, standing 2 meters away with the wet towel in her hand, would later say that she had seen many people in pain in her lifetime, but had never seen anyone hurt in quite that way. He understood that the woman he loved had just been humiliated in front of 40 people. And the first thing she thought about wasn't the pain in her shoulder, wasn't the man who had caused it, wasn't justice. She thought about $31,800 and a lease she had signed 3 weeks earlier. She had learned to fear losing her job more than she feared being humiliated. And she had learned it here, in this place, over 6 months, and no one had ever needed to teach her. Alessio didn't say anything. He didn't make promises. He didn't tell her she wasn't going to lose her job. He didn't tell her he would take care of it. He simply reached out, found her left hand, the one that wasn't hurt, and held it. None of the 5 men who had entered with him followed him toward the kitchen door. From the first second, they spread out, each moving in a direction that had clearly been decided beforehand, and not one of them spoke a word from the moment they crossed through the glass doors. Rocco Bianchi walked straight to the main entrance, pulled both doors wide open, propped them there with 2 chairs, then stood in place facing the street. 4 minutes later, when the sound of the ambulance siren died outside, he didn't need to say anything to the 2 paramedics rushing in with their medical bags. He simply stepped aside and raised one hand toward the far end of the dining room. Nico Ferrara stopped beside the table in the middle of the room. He didn't look at the 4 men seated there. He stood 1 meter from the edge of the table, both hands clasped in front of his stomach, and when one of the 3 guests reached toward the phone lying on the tabletop, Nico only gave a slight shake of his head. The man withdrew his hand, the empty bowl, the towel Kessler had thrown down, all 4 glasses. Nothing on that table moved another centimeter for the next 22 minutes. August Wolf walked straight through the kitchen, without asking for directions, and stopped in front of the narrow door beside the dry storage room, where a 61-year-old woman was still sitting on the plastic chair. He bent down and said one very short sentence to her, that she had done very well, and that she could stand up now. Bertie Nolan stood, and when she did, her knees could no longer hold her. August caught her by the elbow and supported her until she was able to sit down in another chair. Then he turned around and took the exact place she had just left. Emiliano Sarno went to table number 7. He leaned down, spoke quietly to the 2 people sitting there, and Josephine Ainsley looked up at him for a long time before nodding. He helped her to her feet, handed Walter the cane resting against the table leg, and escorted both of them to the front lobby, away from everything. Before leaving, Walter Ainsley bent down, picked up the 3 pieces of wood from the floor, and slipped them into his coat pocket. Gideon Frost stood at the back door. When 2 police cars arrived, he was the one who opened the door for the officers and told them where everyone in the building was. No one raised his voice, not once. Not one of those 5 men reached inside his coat. No one blocked anyone's path, and no one said a single word to Warren Kessler. And that was exactly what made him seem smaller. Because Warren Kessler had spent 29 years living in a world where power meant who spoke louder, who was led to the better table, who could make another person lower their head with a single sentence. He stood in the middle of his own dining room, wearing his own suit, and not one of those 5 men seemed to think he was worth looking at. He told the first police officer who entered that there had been an accident in the kitchen. He said one of his employees had been careless, that the situation was unfortunate, and that he would cover all medical expenses. Alessio Vitali rose from the floor. He turned around and looked at Warren Kessler for the first time that night. "You lease this floor. I'll let the law say the rest." Then he said nothing more, not one word to anyone for the next 40 minutes, until the ambulance pulled away from Hanover Street. Kessler waited for a threat. He knew how to deal with threats. What he received instead was the silence of a man who had already made his decision. At 3 o'clock in the morning, in the office on the 11th floor of Vitali Group, Rocco Bianchi placed a thin file on the desk and stepped back. It was an inventory of 14 commercial properties that had been acquired through an intermediary fund 3 weeks earlier, with a list of tenants attached, not yet reviewed, not yet read carefully by anyone. The Ember Room appeared on the 9th line. Alessio Vitale stared at those words for a long time, so long that Rocco had to look away, and then he said only one sentence before closing the file. "So I've been taking rent from him." It took Warren Kessler 3 days to understand that he wouldn't be able to buy that woman's silence simply by waiting, and once he understood, he didn't apologize. He did what men like him always did when they found themselves backed into a corner, which was to look for people one step weaker than themselves. On Wednesday morning, 4 employees received letters in the mail. The first was a 43-year-old kitchen assistant, raising 2 children alone, someone who had worked at the Ember Room for 8 years. The reason listed in the letter was shift restructuring. The second was a 21-year-old college student who worked nights to pay his spring tuition, and the reason given was the end of his probationary period, even though he had completed probation 11 months earlier. The third was a food runner. The fourth was the man who worked the cold station, the one who had called out the seafood soup order that night. All 4 of them had been in the dining room or the kitchen on Saturday night. All 4 had seen what happened. Not one of them had told the police anything. That was the remarkable part. They had stayed silent. They had done exactly what fear told them to do, and they still lost their jobs. That same day, Kessler's attorney filed a civil suit in Suffolk County Court. The complaint named Maren Callahan 2 allegations: property damage, on the claim that she had deliberately damaged restaurant equipment and property on the night of the incident, and commercial defamation, on the claim that she had spread false information that harmed a business with 29 years of established reputation. The amount demanded in damages was $200,000. Maren received a copy of the lawsuit on Wednesday afternoon, just after returning from the clinic where her bandage had been changed. She read it sitting on the front steps of her building in Charlestown, because she didn't want to carry that paper upstairs to the 3rd floor where Toby was doing his homework. She read all 3 pages. Then she read the second page again, the one with the number, 200,000. There was something no one ever told people in Maren's position, that the second fall always hurt more than the first. The first one came without warning, and there wasn't enough time to be afraid. The second came after a person had managed to stand up a little, after they had begun to believe the worst was over, and it struck directly at the small hope that had only just begun to rise. She sat on those steps for 20 minutes in the cold. She didn't cry. She did the math, the way she always did. 31,800 plus 200,000. No job, no income, a lease with 11 months still left on it. Then she folded the complaint, slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, walked up to the 3rd floor, and asked Toby whether his math homework was difficult that day. But Warren Kessler had miscalculated. He thought firing 4 people would make the other 20 more afraid. He had used that calculation for 29 years, and it had always worked. This time it didn't. For one very simple reason he had never been forced to learn. Fear only keeps people silent as long as that silence still buys them something. As long as lowering their heads protects their jobs, people will lower their heads. But when 4 people had lowered their heads exactly as they were supposed to, had said nothing to the police, had done everything expected of them, and still received termination letters in the mail, the calculation collapsed. If silence still costs you your job, then what is silence for? On Wednesday night, the 43-year-old kitchen assistant called the 21-year-old student. The student called another food runner who still worked there. That food runner called 2 more people. By 11 o'clock that night, 7 people had spoken to one another on the phone, and not one of those 7 used the word brave to describe what they were doing. They were simply comparing what they remembered. And when they began fitting the pieces together, something appeared that none of them had ever been able to see while standing alone. Not one terrible Saturday night. A list. The kitchen assistant remembered a young woman who had been fired the year before after complaining about her shifts. The food runner remembered another name, from 2 years earlier, someone who had suddenly quit in the middle of the week and whose name no one had been allowed to mention. Close to midnight, one of the 7 sent Bernadette Nolan a message and asked whether, after 19 years working there, she remembered those things. Bertie Nolan sat in her own kitchen, staring at the phone screen for a very long time. Then she replied that she remembered everything. The lawyer arrived on Friday morning without an appointment, standing in the lobby of the Charlestown building and ringing the 3rd floor apartment buzzer at 9:15. Toby had already gone to school. Maren opened the door wearing a long-sleeved sweater that completely covered her right shoulder, and she didn't invite him inside. He had no intention of coming in either. He only needed 4 minutes, he said, and he placed a leather briefcase on the stair railing. Inside were 3 things. The first was a 6-page agreement, printed on both sides, with the signature lines already marked by small yellow tabs. The second was a written commitment to withdraw the entire civil lawsuit filed in Suffolk County Court within 48 hours of her signing. The third was a check. The lawyer explained everything very briefly and very politely. His client acknowledged that regrettable things had happened that night. His client didn't want to prolong the matter for the sake of everyone involved, especially her. If she signed, the lawsuit disappeared, the money would be transferred within 2 business days, and she would never have to hear the name Warren Kessler again. Maren picked up the check. She didn't look at the signature. She looked at the number, and something ran down her spine, colder than the February chill in the hallway of that building, because it wasn't a round number. A man trying to make a problem disappear would write 50,000 or 100,000. People always wrote round numbers when they were guessing, because a round number was a way of saying this is what I'm willing to spend, not this is what you need. The number on this check had 4 uneven digits at the end. It added up the $31,800 still remaining on the medical debt notice bearing her mother's name. It added the rent still owed under the lease she had signed 3 weeks before the incident. And it added one more amount that took her 10 seconds to recognize. And when she did, she had to reach out and grip the stair railing. It was the remaining tuition for the sign language interpreting course she was taking. She looked up at the lawyer. "Who told you that number?" The man didn't answer right away. He smiled the way people smiled when they were about to say that it wasn't an important question. Then he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. 3 seconds of silence. Those 3 seconds were a fuller answer than anything he could have said. Because to write down that number, someone had to know the amount of medical debt in the name of a woman who had been dead for 3 years. Someone had to know the date the lease was signed. Someone had to know what class she was taking, where she was taking it, and exactly how much tuition she still owed. No one at the Ember Room had ever asked her those things. She had never told anyone. And standing there in that 3rd-floor hallway, Maren Callahan understood that what had happened to her on Saturday night hadn't been a sudden burst of anger from a man who had been embarrassed. Somewhere inside that building on Hanover Street, there was a file. Inside that file, every employee was a page. On every page was a number. And that number answered exactly one question. How much can this person endure before they have to stay silent? Warren Kessler had never guessed. He knew. He had known for 29 years about every person who passed through that kitchen, and that was why no one had ever walked out. Maren held the check in both hands. She tore it in half. Then she placed the 2 halves together and tore them again. She put the pieces into the lawyer's palm, closed his fingers around them, and told him he could tell his client that she had read everything very carefully. The lawyer left at 9:23. Alessio Vitali had been standing at the foot of the stairs the entire time. He didn't come up. He didn't say a word during those 4 minutes. He didn't leave either. When she turned and saw him, she stopped on the 4th step, and she realized that a man who could buy the entire building before lunch had chosen to stand at the bottom of the staircase like a delivery man. He didn't ask whether she had signed. He didn't ask how much the number was. He didn't tell her she had done the right thing, and he didn't tell her she should reconsider, because $200,000 was a very real price, and he could pay it in 3 minutes. He said only one thing: "I'm here no matter what you choose." And Maren, standing on the 4th step with ink still staining both hands from the check she had just torn apart, understood that it was the only thing he could have said without taking something away from her. Bertie Nolan came to the apartment in Charlestown on Saturday afternoon, exactly 1 week after that night, carrying a box of pastries and a piece of paper folded into quarters. She sat at the dining table, drank half a cup of tea, and talked about the weather for 6 minutes before sliding the paper across the table. She said she had spent 4 nights wondering whether she should give Maren this, because giving it to her meant pulling one more person into the matter, and that person had gone a very long way to avoid ever having to think about it again. On the piece of paper was a name and a city. Colleen Byrne, Worcester. Maren asked who she was. Bertie set down her teacup and began to tell her, and she told it slowly, because some things have to be told slowly if they are going to be told completely. 2 years earlier, on a January night, a 31-year-old server had written down the wrong order for the table of a regular guest. The wrong wine. That was all. Warren Kessler told her to go into the walk-in cooler and get the bottle he wanted, and when she stepped inside, he shut the door. The walk-in cooler at the Ember Room could only be opened from the outside. Kessler knew that. He stood outside for 40 minutes. When he finally opened the door, she couldn't walk out on her own. The man working the cold station had to go in, carry her out, and cover her with 3 aprons. No one called an ambulance because Kessler said she only needed to sit beside the oven for a while. 3 weeks later, Colleen Byrne quit. 4 months later, she moved away from Boston. Bertie said she had heard something about $45,000, but she wasn't certain, because after that day, no one at the Ember Room was allowed to mention that name again. Maren went to Worcester on Monday morning. Alessio offered to drive her, and she said no, and he didn't ask a second time. She took the 7:10 train. Colleen Byrne was 33 now, working part-time as an accountant for a building materials company, living in a small house with a front yard and a child's bicycle leaning against the porch. She opened the door, looked at Maren for 3 seconds, then asked who she was. Maren gave her name. Then she said the name of the restaurant. Colleen Byrne stood still for a long time. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. They sat in the kitchen for nearly 2 hours. Colleen didn't ask what had happened. She only looked at the way Maren held her right shoulder when she sat down, and she knew. She said that during those 40 minutes, she had pounded on the door for the first 15, then stopped. She said the most frightening part hadn't been the cold. The most frightening part was hearing footsteps pass outside that door again and again, and not once did the door open. Then she told Maren about the check. She said people liked to think that those who took the money were weak, and she had spent 2 years telling herself that she wasn't weak. She had a 3-year-old child at the time, credit card debt, and a husband who had left the summer before. $45,000 meant 14 months when she didn't have to be afraid. "I took the money because I had a child," she said. "I don't regret it." Then she was silent for a long time, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. "I only regret that I thought I was the last one." That was what they had told her. The lawyer had sat at this very kitchen table and said it was an isolated incident, a mistake, that his client was deeply sorry and would never allow anything like it to happen again. She had believed him. She had needed to believe him, because if she hadn't, she wouldn't have been able to spend the money. Colleen stood up, went into the back room, and returned with an envelope that had yellowed with age. The lawyer had asked her to destroy her copy. He had made that very clear when she signed. She had nodded, and that night she carried it to the trash bin behind the house, stood there for 5 minutes, then brought it back inside and pushed it beneath the lining of the bottom drawer of her dresser. She said she didn't know why she had kept it. She only knew she couldn't throw it away. 3 days later, the two women sat in a small room at the Suffolk County District Attorney's office, across from a 52-year-old woman named Priscilla Hobbs. Colleen Byrne asked the question she had carried inside herself for 2 years. She asked whether she could be sued because she had signed a paper saying she would never speak. Priscilla Hobbs read the agreement from beginning to end, then placed it on the table. She said a civil agreement could prevent Colleen from suing for more money. It could prevent her from taking the story to the press. But there was no piece of paper in this state, no signature, no amount of money that could stop a witness from testifying in court in a criminal case. She added one more sentence, and Colleen Byrne lowered her head when she heard it. "They've been lying to you for 2 years, Miss Byrne, not just once." Warren Kessler's statement was filed in the 3rd week, and it contained one detail no one had expected. He didn't deny that the bowl of soup had spilled. He couldn't deny that anymore. Instead, the statement described an entirely different sequence of events, one in which the floor manager was the person who had ordered the server to bring the dish out in a way that violated procedure. The floor manager was the person who had shut down the camera system without the owner's approval. And the floor manager was the person who should bear responsibility for what happened in the dining room that night. The name in the statement was Curtis Vane. He was dismissed on Thursday. By Friday, his name appeared on the list of people who could potentially face charges. He came to see Maren on Saturday afternoon, standing in the lobby of the Charlestown building in the exact place where the lawyer had stood 2 weeks earlier. He had lost weight. He wasn't wearing a suit, and there was no leather-bound book in his hands. He said he hadn't given any orders. He said Kessler was throwing him aside to save himself. He said he had 3 children, the oldest 13, and a mortgage with 19 years left to pay, and that if he was charged, no restaurant in this city would ever hire him again. Then he asked her to withdraw the complaint. He said that if she withdrew it, everything would stop, and all of them could move on. And that 40-year-old man stood crying in the cold hallway of a building in Charlestown, and Maren Callahan watched him cry. She didn't scold him. She didn't tell him he deserved what was happening. She didn't mention the leather-bound book, didn't mention the 2 cameras, didn't mention the white towel or who it had been handed to. She asked only one question. "You stood 3 meters away from me for 2 minutes. What did you do with those 3 meters?" Curtis Vane couldn't answer. He opened his mouth twice, and nothing came out. And in the end, he turned and walked toward the door, and she closed it behind him. 3 days later, Priscilla Hobbs called Maren into her office. She didn't say anything at first. She simply turned the computer screen toward her and pressed play. It was a video recorded from above, at an angle, from the kitchen ceiling looking toward the sliding door and part of the passage leading into the dining room. The image was clearer than Marin had expected, and there was sound. There was the sound of the order being called out. There was Mrs. Nolan's voice asking someone whether he had really ordered that dish. There were footsteps, then about 40 seconds in which almost nothing happened, only the sound of the ventilation hood. Then came the sound. Marin reached out and pressed pause before that part finished playing. Priscilla Hobbs said nothing for a long while. Then she turned the screen back toward herself and told Marin what had really brought her there that day. The video hadn't been obtained by the police. It wasn't among the evidence sealed from the recording system. It had been sent to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office inbox at 1:17 on Sunday morning, 2 hours and 10 minutes after the incident, 4 days before Marin Callahan filed her complaint. There was no sender's name, no message, only one attachment and a timestamp. She said the technical team had spent 2 weeks tracing it, and they had managed to trace it because the sender had used an account opened with a phone number registered in his own name. Priscilla Hobbs placed a sheet of paper on the desk and turned it toward Marin. Curtis Vane. Marin stared at the name for a long time. She thought about a man standing in front of the electrical cabinet at 10:15 that night, shutting down 2 cameras, and not telling his employer there was still a third. She thought about the way he had picked up 2 pieces of broken porcelain and handed the towel to the wrong person. She thought about him sitting somewhere at 1:17 in the morning, alone, copying a file and typing the email address of the district attorney's office into the recipient field, then leaving the sender name blank. There are people who are cowards during the 2 defining minutes of their lives, and they carry those 2 minutes with them for the rest of their days. Curtis Vane had stood 3 meters away from her and done nothing. That would never change, and no video could erase it. But he hadn't been a coward for his entire life. He simply hadn't been brave enough to sign his name to the one decent thing he had done. Warren Kessler requested a meeting near the end of March, and the most telling thing about that request was that he never asked to meet Marin Callahan. He called the Vitale Group office. He left a message with the secretary saying that he wanted to speak with the man in charge, just the 2 of them, no lawyers, and that he believed 2 grown men could settle the matter in 20 minutes. That was how he understood the world. For 29 years, every problem he had ever faced had been resolved that way. 2 men, 1 room, 1 number. The woman whose shoulder had been burned wasn't a party to this negotiation. She was a line item. Alessio Vitale agreed to the meeting. Rocco Bianchi asked him once if he was certain, and Alessio replied that he wanted to hear all of it, from beginning to end, because there were some things a person needed to hear with his own ears before he could understand just how large they truly were. The meeting took place at 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, on the 11th floor, with no one else in the room. Warren Kessler spoke for 14 minutes. He began by saying that he understood this had become personal, and that he was sorry he hadn't known. He emphasized that phrase 3 times in the first 4 minutes. If he had known, it wouldn't have happened. As though what made the act wrong wasn't the act itself, but the identity of the person who had suffered it. Then he gave a number, $400,000, transferred immediately, with no conditions. Then he offered what he believed was his strongest card, his entire ownership stake in the Ember Room, transferred within 30 days. He said he knew Vitale Group owned the building, that this way everything inside that building would belong to one person, clean and simple. He said that girl could keep her job if she wanted, or she could manage the place. He didn't care. Alessio Vitale listened through all 14 minutes. He didn't interrupt once. He took no notes. He sat with both hands resting on the table and looked directly at the 58-year-old man presenting a plan in which the victim wasn't even in the room. When Kessler finished, Alessio stood. "You're mistaken." He fastened one button on his coat. "I'm not the person you need to ask, and she isn't for sale." Then he walked toward the door. Kessler called after him, adding one more remark about how both of them were reasonable men, and Alessio Vitale didn't turn around. The trial began in the 2nd week of May at Suffolk County Criminal Court. Walter Ainsley was the first witness. The 79-year-old man submitted the memory card he had hidden inside a hollow block of wood, and it contained 3 weeks of recordings from 4 evenings he had spent sitting at table number 7. He testified that he had worked as a labor inspector for 31 years before retiring, that there had been 3 anonymous complaints about the establishment over the previous 18 months, and that none of them had gone anywhere because no one was willing to put their name to them. The defense attorney asked why he hadn't intervened that night. Walter Ainsley was silent for quite a while. Then he said that he had stood up, that his wife had stopped him, and that he would never blame her for a single second of it. In the second row, Josephine Ainsley lowered her head and raised one hand to cover her face. Colleen Byrne was the second witness. She told them about the 40 minutes. She told them about the footsteps outside the door. When the defense attorney mentioned the agreement she had signed, Priscilla Hobbs rose to her feet, and the judge overruled the question before she could even finish speaking. Curtis Vane was the third witness. He testified for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He testified about the leather-bound book. He testified about the order to shut down the cameras at 10:15. And when he was asked why he hadn't told his employer that there was a third camera, he stared down at his hands for a long time and said he didn't know, that he simply hadn't said anything. The video from the kitchen ceiling was played in the courtroom. No one spoke for the entire duration of it. A female juror in the front row raised one hand to her mouth and kept it there until the screen went dark. The 7 fired employees testified one after another, one each afternoon, and when their accounts were put together, their testimony stretched across 9 years. Maren Callahan was the last. She wore a long-sleeved sweater. She didn't cry. The defense attorney asked about the extent of her injury, the length of her treatment, whether she was capable of returning to work, and she answered every question briefly. Then Priscilla Hobbs asked her one final question. She asked why she hadn't taken the check. Maren stood. She looked toward the second row, where there was a 61-year-old woman, a 33-year-old woman from Worcester, and 7 people who had just lost their jobs. "I'm not standing here because of the bowl of soup." The entire courtroom fell silent. "I'm standing here because for 2 minutes, no one moved." The sentence was handed down at the end of June. Warren Kessler was convicted of assault, causing bodily injury and obstruction of justice, sentenced to prison, and ordered to pay civil compensation to Maren Callahan and Colleen Byrne. Within 3 weeks, the Boston City Licensing Board revoked the business license held in his name, and that was when everyone in the courtroom thought the Ember Room would close. 41 people made their living from that place. 9 people in the kitchen, the dishwasher, the food runners, the delivery workers, the night cleaning staff, the part-time accountant who came in every Tuesday morning. Not one of those 41 people had thrown a bowl of soup. Maren Callahan was the first person to say that aloud, and she said it to her lawyer, not to the press. Alessio Vitali owned the building. He could have terminated the lease in a single afternoon, and the paperwork had been ready for him to do exactly that since March. He didn't. He came to Charlestown one July evening, sat at the small dining table beside the window, and asked her what she wanted him to do with the 9th line on that property list. It was the first time in Maren's life anyone had ever asked her a question like that. Not informed her, not asked for permission after the decision had already been made. Asked, and waited. The lease was transferred in August to a cooperative operated by the employees themselves, and the person who signed on their behalf was the 43-year-old kitchen assistant who had once received her termination letter through the mail. On a Saturday morning in early September, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window and stretched across the wooden floor of the third-floor apartment. Toby sat with his back turned, drawing. Maren stood in the doorway, and she called his name. The boy turned his head. That was all. A beam of sunlight, one very small question, and a turn of the head. Toby looked at his sister, then around the room as though trying to understand where the sound had come from, then back at her, and he smiled. Alessio Vitali stood outside the doorway in the hall, and he didn't step inside. He had driven them there, and had stood in that hallway all morning, but that moment wasn't his, and he knew it. 8 months after the sentence was handed down, a small restaurant opened on Salem Street, 900 meters from the Ember Room, under the name The Quiet Hearth. It was opened with the civil compensation money, together with contributions from 41 people, each giving a very small share. Some contributed $400. Some contributed $2,000. Every name was written on a list posted on the wall behind the counter. Maren refused Alessio's money. She told him that if he paid for it, then it would always be something he had given her. He didn't argue. He only gave the one thing he had the right to give, without taking anything from anyone else. 3 years without rent, written clearly into a notarized contract, with no hidden clauses and no conditions buried in the fine print. The Quiet Hearth was both a restaurant and a vocational training center for people who had once been treated badly at work, and every employee learned sign language during their first 3 months. Bernadette Nolan managed the kitchen. She said that after 19 years standing at a sink, she had never imagined anyone would still ask for her opinion. Colleen Byrne was the first trainee. She moved back from Worcester in October. On opening day, Mr. and Mrs. Ainsley sat at table number 7. Maren had renumbered every table in the restaurant, so that number would belong to the table beside the window. Toby cut the ribbon. The boy brought a new drawing with him, and in that drawing there was still a house with 3 people standing beneath its roof, just like the old picture. But this time he pointed to the third person and said his name aloud. That night, after the last guest had gone home, Maren turned the sign on the door from open to closed. Alessio was waiting on the sidewalk. He held out his hand. He didn't step toward her. He didn't take her hand first. He simply stood there until she was the one who reached out and took his. Then the two of them walked down the cold streets of the North End. Not as a powerful man and someone who had been rescued, but as two people who had come to understand what real love was made of. Because true strength isn't found in the ability to destroy the person who hurt us. It is found in standing beside someone in the fire, protecting their voice, and never claiming the credit for yourself. The worst day of a person's life doesn't define them. What they build after that day does. And perhaps the most precious thing this story leaves behind is the reminder that kindness needs someone willing to stand beside it. That one voice raised at the right moment can awaken an entire room, and that none of us should ever have to lower our heads in exchange for the right to live with dignity. If tonight's story touched you, please leave a like and share it with someone you think may need to hear it. Please subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to more compelling and moving stories every day. And we would truly love to know how this story made you feel. So please leave a comment below and tell us which part of the story stayed in your heart the longest. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.